White cops frame black woman. Bring her to court. Unaware she's a DEA agent. Save the tears, sweetheart. We found the bricks in your trunk. You're looking at 20 years minimum. Officer Reed Steele sneered, his hand resting arrogantly on his holstered weapon. Lennox let her hands tremble against the cold metal of the police cruiser, her wide, tear-filled eyes staring back at the two grinning white officers. Please, I don't know how that got there. You have to believe me, she begged, her voice cracking with manufactured panic. Officer Cullen Fox laughed, slapping the hood. Tell it to the judge. They had no idea who they had just cuffed. Lennox drove her unremarkable, slate-gray sedan at exactly 2 miles below the speed limit. The rhythmic thrum of the tires against the cracked asphalt was the only sound in the cabin, a sharp contrast to the adrenaline humming through her veins. She was coming off a brutal 14-hour shift, working a deep-cover assignment, her mind meticulously cataloging the names, dates, and shipment routes she had just acquired. Then, the darkness was violently pierced by the blinding strobe of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Lennox didn't panic, her heart rate barely spiked. As a seasoned agent for the Drug Enforcement Administration, she was trained to thrive in the chaotic margins of human unpredictability. She signaled smoothly, pulling onto the gravel shoulder with practiced obedience. She shifted into park, turned off the engine, and draped her hands over the steering wheel, right at 10 and 2. In the side mirror, she watched two figures emerge from the patrol car. One moved with a heavy, arrogant swagger, Officer Reed Steele. The other, slightly thinner and visibly more nervous, was Officer Cullen Fox. Lennox knew their faces intimately. They were the primary targets of Operation Undertow, a massive federal probe into police-facilitated cartel trafficking. She just hadn't expected them to target her. To them, she wasn't Special Agent Lennox. She was just a lone black woman driving an unassuming car in a marginalized zip code. An easy target, a convenient statistic. Keep your hands where I can see them, Steele barked as he approached the driver's side, shining his heavy tactical flashlight directly into her retinas. The beam was blinding, meant to disorient and intimidate. Lennox squinted, immediately dropping her shoulders and allowing her breathing to become rapid and shallow. She commanded her tear ducts to swell. Officer? I don't understand. Was I speeding? Her voice trembled, hitting the perfect pitch of a terrified civilian. License and registration. Now, Steele demanded, leaning heavily against her door. He smelled of stale, tobacco, and cheap, bitter coffee. With shaking hands, Lennox retrieved her wallet, handing over the flawless alias documentation provided by the federal government, Lennox Carter. Freelance graphic designer, no criminal record. On the passenger's side, Fox was already sweeping his flashlight over the empty seats. Smells like marijuana in here, Steele, Fox announced. It was a blatant lie. The only thing the car smelled like was the vanilla air freshener dangling from the rearview mirror. Is that right? Steele's lip curled into a predatory smirk. Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. Wait, what? I don't smoke. I swear, I haven't done anything, Lennox pleaded, letting a singular, perfect tear escape and roll down her cheek. She unbuckled her seatbelt with fumbling fingers and stepped out into the humid night air. Steele grabbed her roughly by the bicep, spinning her around and shoving her face first against the side of her own car. The metal was cool against her cheek. She felt Fox walk past her, popping the trunk. For 3 agonizing minutes, there was only the sound of Fox rummaging through her spare tire compartment and emergency kit, and then the heavy thud of a canvas duffel bag hitting the gravel. Well, look what we have here, Fox called out, his voice tinged with a hollow, forced bravado. Steele jerked Lennox away from the car, forcing her to look. Sitting under the harsh glare of the police cruiser's headlights was a black duffel bag. The zipper was pulled back, revealing 6 tightly wrapped bricks of what looked like pure cocaine. Lennox's mind raced, perfectly calm beneath her hysterical facade. They're moving the missing evidence from the 43rd Precinct's lockup. They're using me as the mule to explain its disappearance. No, that isn't mine. I've never seen that bag in my life. Lennox screamed, dropping to her knees on the sharp gravel. She let out a sob that racked her entire body, a masterclass in desperation. Steele laughed, a cruel, guttural sound. He yanked her up by her arms, snapping cold steel handcuffs around her wrists. He ratcheted them down hard, the metal biting painfully into her skin. Save it for the public defender, sweetheart. You're going away for a very long time. As they shoved her into the back of the cruiser, Lennox pressed her face against the cage divider, sobbing loudly. But beneath the shadow of her tangled hair, her eyes were completely dry, burning with a cold, lethal focus. She memorized their badge numbers. She noted the lack of glowing red lights on their body cameras. The trap hadn't just been set for her. They had just walked blindly into hers. The 43rd precinct at 2 in the morning was a purgatory of flickering fluorescent lights, peeling green paint, and the pervasive stench of floor wax and human misery. Lennox was marched through the double doors, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back, her posture slumped in absolute defeat. Steele paraded her past the main desk like a trophy buck, loudly bragging to the desk sergeant about the major cartel bust he and Fox had just pulled off. Fox trailed a few steps behind, carrying the black duffel bag. He looked jittery, his eyes darting toward the security cameras mounted in the corners of the room. Lennox noticed his paranoia immediately. Fox was the weak link. Steele was the architect, arrogant, narcissistic, and entirely convinced of his own invincibility. Lennox was processed under her alias. She allowed them to take her mugshot, keeping her eyes wide, puffy, and appropriately traumatized. She gave her fingerprints, knowing the federal database had been meticulously backstopped by DEA cybertext to only show the boring, civilian life of Lennox Carter. After processing, Steele grabbed her by the arm and dragged her down a narrow, windowless hallway, shoving her into a small holding cell. The heavy iron door slammed shut with a final, echoing clang. Lennox stumbled forward, catching herself on the concrete wall. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light of the cell, she realized she wasn't alone. Huddled on the rigid metal bench in the corner was a young, painfully thin white woman with matted blonde hair and dark, bruised circles under her eyes. She was shivering uncontrollably. Despite the stifling heat of the precinct, Lennox slowly sat down on the opposite end of the bench. She let her breathing steady. "Hey," Lennox whispered softly. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The girl looked up, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic fear. You shouldn't be here." The girl stammered, her voice raspy. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Lennox narrowed her eyes, instantly recognizing the signs of a heavily manipulated confidential informant. "What's your name?" "Daisy," the girl whispered, wrapping her thin arms around her knees. "Steele. Officer Steele. He said if I didn't give him a bust tonight, he was going to call Child Protective Services. He was going to take my little boy. He told me to point at a car. Any car. I saw you driving by and..." I pointed. "I didn't know he was going to put all that weight on you. I swear to God, I didn't know." Daisy broke down, burying her face in her hands, her sobs echoing off the concrete walls. A profound, icy rage settled into the marrow of Lennox's bones. This was how they did it. They preyed on the vulnerable, the broken, the terrified mothers, and the addicted, weaponizing them to build fake cases and cover their own tracks. Steele and Fox weren't just corrupt. They were a cancer on the community. Lennox slid closer, her voice shifting from the panicked victim to something entirely different. Something maternal, grounded, and terrifyingly calm. "Daisy, look at me." Daisy slowly raised her head. "You didn't do this to me," Lennox said, her gaze piercing through the dim light. "They did. And I promise you, on my life, Steele will never be able to threaten your child again. You are going to be safe." Before Daisy could process the absolute certainty in the strange woman's voice, the heavy iron door swung open. Steele stood in the frame, his silhouette blocking the light from the hallway. "Carter." "Interrogation room." "Now," he barked. Lennox instantly shrank into herself, her shoulders curving inward, her chin dropping to her chest. She shuffled out of the cell, playing the part of the broken woman to perfection. In the cramped interrogation room, Steele slammed a file onto the metal table. He leaned over, invading her personal space, trying to intimidate her with his size. Here's how this goes, Lennox. You give me the name of your supplier. You sign a confession saying you were moving the product for the Alvarez cartel, and I put in a good word with the district attorney. Maybe you only do 10 years instead of 20. You refuse? I make sure you get buried so deep you'll never see the sun again. Lennox looked down at the table, forcing her bottom lip to quiver. I want a lawyer, she whimpered, her voice barely above a whisper. Please. Steele sneered, clearly disgusted by what he perceived as her pathetic weakness. Suit yourself. Trash. You'll rot in county until your arraignment tomorrow. He stormed out, leaving Lennox alone in the room. As the door clicked shut, the terrified expression melted off her face like wax. She leaned back in the uncomfortable metal chair, a dark, predatory smile touching the corners of her mouth. Oh, Reed, she thought. I'm bringing a lawyer, just not the kind you expect. The courthouse holding cells beneath the imposing marble structure of the city's judicial center were a chaotic symphony of shouting inmates, clanking keys, and the dull hum of ancient ventilation. It was 8 a.m. In precisely 1 hour, Lennox would stand before a judge to be arraigned on felony trafficking charges. She sat quietly on the bench, wearing a deeply unflattering, oversized Orange County jumpsuit. She looked small, disheveled, and perfectly harmless. The heavy steel door of the interview booth opened, and a woman stepped inside. The chaotic noise of the holding area seemed to instantly dampen in her presence. Avery Vance was a striking woman, dressed in an impeccably tailored, charcoal gray Tom Ford suit. Her heels clicked with authority against the concrete floor. To the guards outside, she was a high-priced, ruthless defense attorney who had mysteriously taken up the case of a random public defender overflow. To Lennox, she was the assistant United States attorney for the Southern District and one of her closest friends. Avery sat down across the glass partition, sliding her sleek leather briefcase onto the counter. She picked up the intercom phone. Lennox picked up hers. You look terrible, Avery said, her tone deadpan, though a glint of fierce amusement danced in her eyes. Orange is not my season, Lennox replied smoothly, the tremor completely gone from her voice. Do we have it? Avery nodded, opening her briefcase and pulling out a thick, sealed manila folder. Everything. The DEA tech team pulled the GPS data from Steele and Fox's cruiser. It puts them at an abandoned cartel stash house exactly 30 minutes before they pulled you over. We have the wiretap audio from Steele's burner phone negotiating the sale of the seized bricks they tried to pin on you. And the icing on the cake? We recovered the deleted body cam footage from the cloud backup they didn't know existed. It shows Fox pulling the duffel bag from their own trunk before bringing it to yours. Lennox closed her eyes, letting out a slow, satisfied breath. What about Daisy? Secured, Avery confirmed, her voice softening slightly. Federal marshals pulled her from the precinct an hour ago. She's in a safe house with her son. She's agreed to testify to Steele's extortion. Good, Lennox murmured, her eyes hardening. Who is the judge? Judge Celeste, Avery said, a predatory smile spreading across her face. Strict constructionist. Absolutely zero tolerance for police misconduct. She has ruined careers for less than a tampered report. When she sees what we're about to put on her desk, she might just leap over the bench and strangle Steele herself. Meanwhile, 2 floors up in the brightly lit, bustling hallway of the courthouse, Officers Steele and Fox were drinking overpriced coffee from the cafeteria. Steele was leaning against the polished marble wall, looking thoroughly pleased with himself. Did you see the DA's face when I handed over the evidence report? Steele laughed, adjusting his heavy utility belt. Open and shut. We get a commendation. The missing stash house bricks are explained away, and we're clear to make the drop tomorrow. Fox rubbed the back of his neck, his face pale, sweat beading at his hairline. I don't know, man. Something feels off. Her background check came back totally clean. Like, too clean. Not even a parking ticket. What if she has people? What if she fights it? Steele rolled his eyes, clapping Fox hard on the shoulder. Fox, look around. Look at where we are. We are the law. She's a nobody from the South Side. By noon, she'll be pressured into a plea deal, and we'll be at O'Malley's drinking to our own brilliance. Relax. Inside courtroom 302, the atmosphere was solemn and heavy. Judge Celeste, a formidable woman with sharp features and piercing silver eyes, sat behind the elevated mahogany bench. She was currently reviewing the morning's docket. Her pen paused over the file labeled State v. Carter. Lennox. Something about the police report felt sloppy. Too neat in its narrative, yet missing crucial procedural timestamps. Her brow furrowed, making a mental note to grill the arresting officers. All rise. The bailiff bellowed as the heavy oak doors swung open. Lennox was led into the courtroom by two armed deputies. She kept her head down, her shoulders hunched, the chains around her waist clinking softly in the silent room. She allowed herself to look absolutely terrified as she was guided to the defense table. Moments later, Steele and Fox strutted into the gallery, taking seats directly behind the assistant district attorney. Steele caught Lennox's eye and offered her a cruel, mocking wink. Lennox immediately looked down at the table, hiding the lethal, triumphant smile that threatened to break across her face. The wooden gate swung open, and Avery walked in, her heels clicking like a metronome, counting down to an execution. She sat down next to Lennox, placing her leather briefcase onto the table with a soft, authoritative thud. Avery leaned over, whispering so only Lennox could hear. Showtime, Agent. Courtroom 302 was a theater of heavy mahogany, polished brass, and institutional dread. It was a place where lives were routinely and irrevocably altered before the lunch recess. The air was aggressively air-conditioned, carrying the faint, sterile scent of lemon pledge masked by the sour tang of nervous sweat radiating from the defendant's gallery. Judge Evelyn Celeste presided over this domain with the cold, unyielding authority of an ancient monarch. She adjusted her reading glasses, her sharp silver eyes scanning the manila file folder set before her, clearly labeled State v. Carter Lennox. At the prosecutor's table stood Assistant District Attorney Markowitz, a young, impeccably groomed lawyer who was eager to please the police department and climb the political ladder. He bounced slightly on his heels, projecting the restless energy of a man who believed he was holding a winning lottery ticket. A few feet away at the defense table, Lennox sat perfectly still. She had physically shrunk into herself, pulling the oversized, stiff fabric of her Orange County jumpsuit tightly around her shoulders. She looked small, defeated, and utterly broken. Her hands, resting on the polished wood of the table, trembled with a meticulously calculated rhythm. Beside her, Avery Vance sat with perfect posture, her tailored charcoal suit a stark contrast to the despair radiating from her supposed client. Avery's face was an impenetrable mask of professional stoicism. In the gallery directly behind the prosecutor, officers Reed Steele and Cullen Fox sat in the front row, taking up as much space as physically possible. Steele had his legs splayed wide, his arms resting casually on the back of the wooden pew. He looked like a king surveying his conquered territory. Every so often, he would lean over and whisper something to Fox, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. Fox, however, looked less like a conqueror and more like a man standing on a trapdoor. He was sweating profusely, his pale eyes darting nervously around the room, wiping his palms repeatedly on his dark uniform trousers. "All right, let's move this along," Judge Celeste announced, her voice slicing through the low murmur of the courtroom like a scalpel. She did not look up from the file. Case number 44-098. State of New York versus Lennox Carter. Charges are felony possession of a Class A, controlled substance with intent to distribute. Assistant District Attorney Markowitz, are you prepared to proceed with the arraignment? We are, Your Honor, Markowitz said smoothly, buttoning his suit jacket as he stood tall. The state intends to show that the defendant was apprehended last night during a routine traffic stop. Thanks to the diligent, proactive, and frankly heroic policing of officers Steele and Fox of the 43rd Precinct, Over 6 kilos of pure cocaine were recovered from the defendant's vehicle before it could poison our city's streets. Given the sheer volume of the narcotics and the clear flight risk the defendant poses, the state respectfully requests that bail be denied or set no lower than $500,000. In the gallery, Steele nodded approvingly, crossing his arms over his chest. He caught Lennox's eye and offered her a slow, mocking wink. Lennox instantly dropped her gaze to the table, forcing a quiet, pathetic sob to escape her lips. Avery reached over, placing a gentle, reassuring hand on Lennox's shoulder. It was the picture-perfect image of a desperate defense attorney trying to comfort a doomed client. Judge Celeste finally looked up, her piercing gaze settling on the defense table. She studied Lennox for a long, quiet moment. Something about the police report still bothered her. It was entirely too perfect, a frictionless narrative that lacked the messy reality of actual police work. "Miss Carter," the judge said, her tone softening just a fraction. "These are incredibly severe charges. You are facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a state penitentiary if convicted. Do you understand the charges brought against you?" Lennox looked up, her eyes swimming in manufactured tears. She swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing. I understand what he's saying, Your Honor, but I swear to you, I didn't do it. I don't know how that bag got in my car. Please, you have to believe me." Her voice cracked perfectly on the final syllable. Markowitz rolled his eyes dramatically. Steele chuckled aloud in the gallery, a sound that earned him a sharp, warning glare from the bench. "That is what a jury is for, Miss Carter," Judge Celeste said firmly, though her eyes remained locked on the weeping woman. She then turned her attention to Avery. "Miss Vance, it is highly unusual to see a partner from a white shoe firm handling a midnight overflow arraignment for a public defender. I assume you are here to argue for bail?" Avery stood up. She did not rush. She took her time, smoothing the front of her jacket, her movements deliberate and hypnotic. She looked at Markowitz, then turned her head to look directly at Steele and Fox in the gallery. For a split second, the impenetrable mask dropped, and Steele saw something terrifying in the attorney's eyes. She wasn't looking at him like a police officer. She was looking at him like prey. Avery turned back to the judge. "Actually, Your Honor, we are not seeking bail." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Markowitz beamed, assuming the defense was completely folding. Steele leaned back, a triumphant grin splitting his face. "She's going to plead out right now," Steele thought. "Easiest frame job of my life. We are not seeking bail," Avery repeated, her voice ringing out clear and authoritative. "Because my client has no intention of spending another second in state custody." At this time, the defense waives a reading of the charges and instead moves for an immediate dismissal with prejudice. Judge Celeste raised a single, perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Dismissal? Miss Vance, this is an arraignment. Unless you have a magical wand in that expensive briefcase, I suggest you rethink your strategy before I hold you in contempt." "No magic wand, Your Honor," Avery said, reaching into her briefcase and pulling out the thick, sealed manila folder. "Just the truth. I am moving for an immediate dismissal based on explosive, exculpatory evidence of gross police misconduct, evidence tampering, and federal corruption. Furthermore, I have a motion to compel the immediate arrest of the 2 officers sitting in your gallery, pursuant to federal indictments unsealed at exactly 8 o'clock this morning." The silence that slammed into the courtroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a detonation. Markowitz's jaw dropped. In the gallery, Steele's triumphant grin vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of utter confusion. Fox let out a soft, high-pitched gasp, physically shrinking back into the wooden pew. Judge Celeste gripped her gavel, her knuckles turning white. "Counselor," she warned, her voice dropping an octave into a dangerous, icy register. "You had better explain yourself this instant." Avery smiled a sharp, lethal expression. "With pleasure, Your Honor. The woman sitting beside me is not Lennox Carter. Lennox Carter is a meticulously constructed, federally backstopped alias. My client is Special Agent Lennox of the United States Drug Enforcement Administration. At the defense table, Lennox stopped trembling. The tears instantly vanished from her eyes. She straightened her spine, her posture transforming from a cowering victim into a hardened federal predator. She looked back over her shoulder, locking eyes with Reed Steele. And this time, it was Lennox who smiled. Pandemonium threatened to break out in courtroom 302, but it was instantly squashed by the explosive, gunshot-like crack of Judge Celeste's gavel. Order. There will be absolute order in my courtroom, she bellowed, her voice echoing off the high, paneled ceilings. The murmuring gallery fell dead silent. ADA Markowitz looked as though he might physically vomit. He gripped the edges of his table, his knuckles white, staring at Avery Vance in horror. Your Honor, Markowitz stammered, his voice pitching high with panic. This is absurd. This is a stunt. The state has physical evidence. We have a sworn police report, a sworn work of fiction, Mr. Markowitz. Avery interrupted smoothly, walking confidently toward the bench. She handed the sealed manila folder to the bailiff, who passed it up to Judge Celeste. Inside that folder, Your Honor, you will find the unsealed federal indictments against Officers Reed Steele and Cullen Fox. For the past 18 months, Special Agent Lennox has been the primary undercover operative in Operation Undertow, a joint federal task force investigating a police-facilitated trafficking ring operating out of the 43rd Precinct. In the gallery, the air seemed to evaporate around Reed Steele. The smug invincibility that had defined his entire life suddenly collapsed, leaving him free-falling into a void of pure terror. He stared at the back of Lennox's head, the black woman he had singled out, the woman he had shoved against a car, the woman he thought was a powerless nobody. She was a ghost. She was the federal government. Beside him, Fox began to hyperventilate. Reed, Fox wheezed, grabbing Steele's arm with a trembling hand. Reed, we gotta get out of here. We gotta go. Sit down and shut up, Steele hissed through clenched teeth, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked frantically toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom, calculating the distance. If it pleases the court, Avery continued, gesturing toward the large presentation monitor mounted on the wall. I have connected a secure federal drive to the court's AV system. We would like to present Exhibit A, the true origin of the narcotics placed in my client's vehicle. Judge Celeste, having swiftly read through the first page of the federal indictment, looked up. Her silver eyes were practically glowing with righteous fury. She looked past Avery, past Markowitz, and locked her gaze directly onto the two officers in the gallery. Proceed, Miss Vance, she commanded softly. It was the terrifying quiet of a looming hurricane. Avery tapped a button on her tablet. The courtroom speakers crackled to life, filling the room with the undeniably distinct, gruff voice of Officer Reed Steele. It was a recording from a wiretapped burner phone. Audio Steele. Yeah, I got the package. 6 bricks. Skimmed right off the top of the Alvarez bust before it hit evidence. You have the cash? Audio unidentified mail. I have it. But how are you explaining the missing weight at the precinct? Internal Affairs is sniffing around. Audio Steele. Laughter. Don't worry about IA. Fox and I are going fishing tonight on the south side. We'll find some random banger or some clueless civilian. We toss the bricks in their trunk, arrest them, and claim we just took the missing weight off the streets. We look like heroes, the books balance, and we get paid. It's foolproof. The audio clicked off. Markowitz slowly sank into his chair, covering his face with his hands. His career was flashing before his eyes. But we didn't just rely on audio, Your Honor, Avery said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. She tapped her tablet again. Exhibit B. Officers Steele and Fox believed they had manually deactivated their body cameras prior to the illegal search. However, the DEA tech team remotely accessed the precinct's cloud server and recovered the deleted, cached footage. The large screen flickered, showing a shaky, high-definition video from the perspective of Officer Fox's chest. The timestamp read 1:14 a.m. The video showed the trunk of the police cruiser opening. Fox's hands reached in, grabbing the black canvas duffel bag. The camera panned wildly as Fox walked toward the slate gray sedan. It showed Lennox standing in the distance, facing the car, completely unaware. The video clearly showed Fox dropping the bag into Lennox's open trunk, backing away, and then yelling, well, look what we have here." The video paused on a freeze frame of Fox's guilty face reflected in the shiny paint of the sedan. "Mother of God," Judge Celeste whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of disgust and absolute rage. She slammed her hands down on the mahogany bench, rising to her feet. The authority she radiated was apocalyptic. "Officers Steele and Fox, you have desecrated the badge you wear. You have turned this courtroom into an instrument of your own vile corruption." Steele couldn't take it anymore. The primal instinct to flee overrode any remaining shred of rational thought. "This is a setup," Steele roared, jumping to his feet and shoving Fox out of the way. He bolted for the heavy oak doors at the back of the gallery. "Bailiff, secure those doors," Judge Celeste screamed. Steele threw his shoulder against the heavy wood, bursting through the doors into the hallway. But he only made it 2 steps. Waiting in the marble corridor was a tactical wall of 6 heavily armed United States federal marshals, wearing olive drab tactical vests with U.S. Marshal emblazoned in bright yellow letters across their chests. At the center of the formation stood a towering marshal, who didn't even blink as Steele nearly crashed into him. "Officer Reed Steele," the lead marshal said, his voice deep and entirely devoid of emotion. He racked a round into the chamber of his M4 rifle, a sound that echoed terrifyingly in the polished hallway. "Get on the ground." "Now." Steele froze. The arrogance finally drained from his body, leaving nothing but the hollow shell of a coward. He slowly raised his hands and dropped to his knees on the cold marble floor. Inside the courtroom, Fox didn't even try to run. He collapsed back into the wooden pew, burying his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably as 2 court bailiffs approached him, unholstering their handcuffs. Lennox remained seated at the defense table. She watched through the open courtroom doors as a federal marshal forcefully shoved Steele flat onto his stomach, yanking his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the federal handcuffs ratcheting securely around Steele's wrists sounded like music to her ears. Avery leaned over, closing her briefcase with a satisfying snap. "Well," she whispered to Lennox, a proud smile on her face, "I'd say that went significantly better than a plea deal." Lennox finally stood up. She looked at the judge, giving a short, respectful nod, before looking out at the ruined men being dragged away. "Karma," Lennox murmured, "is a federal offense. The federal holding cells located in the subterranean levels of the courthouse were vastly different from the chaotic, filthy precinct lockups. Here, the air was heavily climate-controlled, the concrete was immaculately clean, and the silence was absolute. It was a sterile, unforgiving tomb designed to break the spirits of high-level cartel bosses and corrupt politicians. Reed Steele paced the length of his 6x8 cell like a caged, rabid animal. His police uniform had been unceremoniously stripped from him, replaced by a stiff, scratchy, forest green federal jumpsuit. He had been thoroughly searched, stripped of his belt, his shoelaces, and every shred of his dignity. In the adjacent cell, separated by a thick wall of reinforced plexiglass, Cullen Fox sat curled into a tight fetal position on his metal cot. He hadn't stopped crying since they dragged him out of courtroom 302. "Shut up, Fox. Just shut up," Steele snapped, kicking the heavy steel door of his cell. "You're giving me a migraine. My union rep is going to be here any minute. We just have to stick to the story. We claim the DEA manufactured the evidence to cover up their agent's dirty side hustle." Fox slowly lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, his face swollen and pale. He looked at Steele not with loyalty, but with a sudden, venomous hatred born of sheer desperation. "Are you insane, Reed? Did you see the video? They had your voice. They had my camera. There is no union rep coming. The department completely disavowed us before we even reached the basement. We hold the line," Steele yelled, pressing his face against the plexiglass. You don't say a word to the feds without a lawyer. You hear me? Fox let out a hollow, manic laugh. I already asked to speak to the assistant U.S. attorney. I'm telling them everything, Reed. Every dollar we stole, every piece of evidence we planted, every CI you threatened. I'll give them all of it if they keep me out of general population. I'm not dying in a federal pen for you. You rat piece of garbage. Steele roared, slamming his fists against the glass. I'll kill you if I ever get my hands on you. The heavy, mechanized lock of the main corridor door disengaged with a loud, echoing clack. Steele instantly stepped back from the glass, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched. He expected his lawyer. He expected an interrogator. Instead, Special Agent Lennox walked down the corridor. She had shed the oversized, humiliating orange jumpsuit. In its place, she wore a tailored, pitch-black federal suit that fit her perfectly. Her DEA badge was clipped prominently to her leather belt, glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her federal-issue Glock 19 rested snugly in a custom Kydex holster on her hip. Her hair, previously tangled to look unkempt, was now pulled back into a sleek, severe braid. She looked towering, authoritative, and completely lethal. She stopped in front of Steele's cell, her posture perfectly relaxed. She didn't look angry. She didn't look smug. She looked at him with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing an insect pinned to a board. Steele gripped the metal bars of the cell door, his knuckles turning white. He tried to summon his old swagger, but his voice shook. Come to gloat, Carter? Or whatever your real name is. Lennox, she said softly, her voice smooth and even. Special Agent Lennox. And no, Reed, I didn't come to gloat. I came to deliver a message. I don't want to hear anything from you. Steele spat, though he couldn't pull his eyes away from the badge on her hip. You're going to listen anyway, Lennox replied, stepping half an inch closer to the bars. Because in about an hour, you're going to be transferred to the Metropolitan Correctional Center. You're being charged with racketeering, extortion, evidence tampering, and federal civil rights violations under color of law. You aren't going to a cushy state prison where the guards will protect you because you used to wear blue. You're going to federal lockdown. You'll be sharing a cell block with the very cartel members you've been ripping off for the last 2 years. Steele swallowed hard, a drop of cold sweat rolling down his temple. The reality of his situation was finally crushing through his denial. You entrapped us, he whispered weakly. Lennox let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Entrapment implies I coerced you into committing a crime you wouldn't normally commit. I didn't coerce you, Reed. I just parked on the side of the road. You did all the rest. You looked at me, a black woman alone at night in a marginalized neighborhood, and you didn't see a human being. You saw a target. You saw someone you thought society wouldn't care about. You thought you could destroy my life just to balance your dirty books. Steele closed his eyes, unable to hold her piercing gaze. Oh, and one more thing, Lennox added, her voice dropping to a softer, deadlier pitch. Daisy is safe. Steele's eyes snapped open. She's in federal protective custody with her son, Lennox continued. She gave us a full, recorded deposition this morning. She detailed exactly how you threatened to call Child Protective Services and take her boy away if she didn't falsely identify targets for you. She's going to be the federal government's star witness at your trial. Steele staggered backward, his knees practically giving out. He bumped into the concrete wall of his cell and slid down until he was sitting on the floor, his head buried in his hands. He was completely, utterly broken. The architect of his own destruction, Lennox watched him for a long moment, feeling a profound, heavy sense of justice settle in her chest. She didn't feel joy. She felt the satisfaction of excising a tumor. She turned away from his cell, not sparing a single glance for Fox, who was still weeping quietly in the corner. Her heels clicked sharply against the concrete floor as she walked back down the corridor, the sound echoing like a ticking clock, marking the end of their lives. As the heavy steel door closed behind her, Lennox stepped out into the bright, bustling hallway of the federal courthouse. Avery was waiting for her near the elevators, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. You good? Avery asked, handing her a cup. Lennox took a slow sip, savoring the bitter, grounding taste. She touched the cold metal of the badge clipped to her belt. "Yeah," Lennox said, a genuine smile finally touching her eyes. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The fallout from courtroom 302 hit the 43rd precinct not like a localized storm, but like a catastrophic seismic event. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the normally grimy, fluorescent-lit bullpen of the precinct had been entirely taken over by a legion of stern-faced men and women wearing navy blue windbreakers with FBI and DEA printed in bold yellow lettering across their backs. The legendary blue wall of silence, the unspoken fraternity code that Officer Reed Steele had relied upon to shield his atrocities, crumbled into dust within hours. Special Agent Lennox walked back through the double-glass doors of the precinct. Just 12 hours prior, she had been dragged through these exact doors in cold steel handcuffs, playing the part of a terrified, broken civilian. Now, she moved with the unimpeded, apex predator stride of a federal agent holding the absolute high ground. Her tailored black suit cut a sharp contrast against the disorganized panic of the local officers, who were being systematically relieved of their duty belts and weapons by internal affairs investigators. Lennox bypassed the front desk entirely, heading straight for the glass-walled office of Captain Thomas Miller. Miller was a heavily jowled man whose career was built on turning a blind eye to the proactive tactics of his street units, so long as his arrest quotas remained artificially high. Right now, he was profusely sweating through his dress shirt, watching federal agents dismantle his kingdom, one filing cabinet at a time. Lennox didn't bother knocking. She pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped inside, her DEA badge gleaming on her belt. Miller looked up from his desk, his face a mottled, unhealthy shade of crimson. "Agent Lennox, I assume," he said, his voice a gravelly mix of forced authority and barely suppressed panic. "I want it on the record that the command staff of this precinct had absolutely zero knowledge of the extracurricular activities of Officers Steele and Fox. They were rogue elements, bad apples. We are fully cooperating with the federal probe." Lennox didn't sit down. She stood over his desk, letting the silence stretch, forcing Miller to stew in his own desperate rationalizations. She leaned forward, placing both hands flat on his polished mahogany desk. "A bad apple, Captain, is an officer who sleeps in his cruiser or skims a 20 off a drug bust. Steele and Fox were operating an armed extortion racket, moving wholesale quantities of cartel cocaine, and terrorizing innocent mothers to balance your precinct's ledger." "I didn't know," Miller protested, standing up, his chair squeaking violently in protest. "You didn't want to know," Lennox corrected, her voice cold, lethal, and devastatingly calm. "You saw the conviction rates they were bringing in. You saw the asset forfeitures. You signed off on their overtime, and you endorsed Steele for a detective shield just last month. Your signature is on the very same evidence logs they were falsifying." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a freshly printed federal subpoena, dropping it onto his desk. The paper landed with a soft, final thud. "You aren't a bystander, Captain. You are an enabler. The Department of Justice is seizing every hard drive, every radio log, and every personnel file in this building for the last 5 years. If we find out you so much as look the other way while Steele threatened a single confidential informant, we aren't just taking your pension. We're taking your freedom." Miller sank back into his chair, the last remaining fight draining out of him as he stared blankly at the subpoena. The kingdom had fallen, leaving the ruined captain to his panic. Lennox exited the precinct and stepped out into the muggy afternoon air. She slid into the passenger seat of an unmarked black SUV parked by the curb. Assistant U.S. Attorney Avery Vance was behind the wheel, typing furiously on her tablet. "How is the captain taking the news of his impending career suicide?" Avery asked, not looking up from her screen. "Like a coward," Lennox replied, buckling her seatbelt and letting out a long, exhausted breath. The adrenaline of the morning was beginning to fade, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary ache. "Have you finished parsing the burner phone data from Steele's locker?" Avery smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression, as she tossed the tablet onto Lennox's lap. "Oh, We have everything. Steele wasn't just skimming from the Alvarez cartel. He was their primary municipal distributor. The phone has GPS coordinates, text threads, and unencrypted ledgers. Hector Alvarez relies on a fortified stash house on the East River docks to process his shipments. Without Steele running interference and feeding them police patrol routes, they are sitting ducks. Lennox looked at the detailed schematic on the tablet screen. The exhaustion in her bones vanished, replaced by the familiar, humming electricity of a hunter who had just caught the scent of blood. The corrupt cops were behind bars, but the poison they had been protecting was still out there. Avery, Lennox said, her eyes darkening with renewed focus. Call the tactical response team. Tell them to gear up. We're taking the Alvarez house down tonight. The East River docks at 2:00 a.m. were a desolate expanse of rusted shipping containers, towering cranes, and the relentless, mechanical groan of the nearby suspension bridge. A dense, freezing fog rolled off the black water, obscuring the sprawling warehouse that served as the nervous system for the Alvarez cartel's northern distribution network. Inside the warehouse, panic was beginning to set in. Hector Alvarez, a ruthless mid-level lieutenant with a scarred jawline and a penchant for extreme violence, paced the concrete floor of the sorting room. On the tables around him, millions of dollars in uncut narcotics sat exposed. Hector checked his encrypted phone for the 20th time in the last hour. Nothing. Where the hell is Steele? Hector barked at one of his heavily armed guards. He was supposed to confirm the patrol shift change an hour ago. We can't move these trucks without his all clear. If the local cruisers are rolling through Sector 4, we'll be spotted immediately. His burner is going straight to voicemail, boss. The guard replied, nervously adjusting the grip on his tactical rifle. Word on the street is the 43rd got hit by the feds this morning. A massive sweep. Word is Steele got snatched right out of a courtroom. Hector's blood ran cold. Steele was his insurance policy, his invisible shield against the justice system. If Steele had been taken by the feds, it was only a matter of time before he flipped. Hector turned to his men, his voice rising to a frantic shout. Pack it up. Everything. Burn the ledgers. Load the product into the vans, and scatter. We abandon the warehouse right now. But it was already too late. Hector had relied so heavily on his corrupt police protection that he had forgotten how to look out for the real wolves in the dark. Outside, the perimeter had already been breached. Special Agent Lennox stood silently in the fog, flanked by a 12-man DEA special response team, clad in heavy, black ballistic armor and night vision goggles. Lennox held a suppressed M4 carbine tightly against her shoulder. The earpiece in her right ear crackled with the quiet, authoritative voice of the team's sniper positioned on a nearby crane. Target building is surrounded. Heat signatures confirm 15 hostiles inside. They are scrambling, packing up, the sniper reported. Lennox raised 2 fingers, signaling the breach team to move up to the reinforced steel doors of the warehouse. She felt the familiar, icy calm wash over her. This was her element. The courtroom had been theater. This was the brutal, unvarnished reality of her profession. Execute, Lennox whispered into her radio. The silence of the docks was instantly shattered by the deafening, concussive boom of a specialized breaching charge tearing the steel doors completely off their hinges. Before the smoke could even begin to clear, Lennox and her team flooded into the warehouse like a highly organized, lethal tidal wave. Federal agents, drop your weapons. Get on the ground. The tactical operators roared in unison, sweeping the massive room with blinding weapon lights. The cartel guards, disoriented by the blast and blinded by the strobes, hesitated. It was a fatal mistake. The DEA team moved with surgical precision, utilizing overwhelming force and flawless geometry to pin the hostiles down. A few guards tried to raise their rifles, but they were immediately neutralized by precise, non-lethal suppression fire that shattered the concrete around their feet, forcing them to drop their weapons and surrender. Lennox moved through the chaos with fluid, practiced efficiency, her eyes scanning the room. She bypassed the low-level guards being zip-tied by her team and headed straight for the elevated office at the back of the warehouse. Through the glass, She saw Hector Alvarez desperately trying to stuff a stack of leather-bound ledgers into a metal trash can, holding a lit flare in his trembling hand. Lennox didn't slow down. She kicked the office door open so hard it splintered the wooden frame. She brought her rifle up, the laser sight resting squarely on the center of Hector's chest. "Drop the flare, Hector, or I drop you," Lennox commanded, her voice slicing through the noise of the raid outside. Hector froze, the flare hovering inches above the damning ledgers. He looked at the tall, imposing federal agent standing in his doorway. He slowly lowered his hands, letting the flare roll harmlessly onto the concrete floor. "You're the one," Hector realized, his voice shaking as he raised his hands above his head. "You're the agent who set up Steele. He thought you were just some civilian on the South Side." "Reed Steele was arrogant," Lennox said, stepping into the room and kicking the flare away. She lowered her rifle, drawing her federal cuffs with her left hand. "He thought his badge made him a god. You thought his corruption made you invincible. You were both wrong." She slammed Hector against the wall, forcefully pulling his arms behind his back and ratcheting the cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. As the metal clicked shut, she looked down at the table, at the millions of dollars of narcotics and the ledgers that would dismantle the entire Alvarez syndicate. The trap she had set on the side of a humid highway had worked perfectly. The corrupt cops were caged, the cartel was broken, and the streets were finally going to be a little safer. Lennox keyed her radio. "Target secure. The warehouse is ours." 8 months had passed since the explosive arraignment that shattered the illusion of Officer Reed Steele's invincibility. Courtroom 302 was once again filled to capacity, but the atmosphere had entirely shifted. It was no longer a theater of dread for the innocent. It had become an altar of absolute accountability. Today was sentencing day. Reed Steele sat at the defense table, but he was unrecognizable from the arrogant, swaggering predator who had once terrorized the city. The months spent in federal lockup had aged him a decade. His hair was thinning and heavily grayed. The stiff, oversized green federal jumpsuit hung loosely on his diminished, hollowed-out frame. He kept his eyes glued to the polished wooden table, unable to look back at the gallery, unable to face the public he had so deeply betrayed. To his right, the prosecutor's table was occupied by Avery Vance, representing the federal government. She stood tall, holding a stack of victim impact statements. The trial had been a massacre. Cullen Fox had taken a federal plea deal in exchange for testifying against his former partner. For 3 days, Fox sat on the witness stand and meticulously outlined every bribe they took, every piece of evidence they planted, and every vulnerable citizen they extorted. The audio recordings, the recovered body cam footage, and the seized cartel ledgers were simply nails in an already sealed coffin. A federal jury had convicted Steele on all 22 counts after only 3 hours of deliberation. "Your Honor," Avery said, her voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "Before you render your sentence, the government calls its final witness to deliver a victim impact statement. We call Daisy Miller." Steele physically flinched at the name. The heavy wooden doors of the gallery opened. Daisy walked down the center aisle, but she was not the terrified, emaciated, shivering informant Lennox had met in the holding cell. She looked healthy. Her blonde hair was clean and neatly styled, and she wore a modest, professional dress. She walked with her head held high, radiating a quiet, newfound strength. She took the stand, sworn in under the watchful, approving gaze of Judge Evelyn Celeste. Daisy adjusted the microphone. She didn't look at the judge. She turned her head and looked directly at Reed Steele. "For 2 years, you made me believe I was worthless," Daisy said, her voice remarkably steady, carrying the heavy weight of truth. "You used my addiction against me. You threatened to take my son away, to put him in the system, if I didn't lie for you. If I didn't help you destroy innocent lives. You told me you were the law, and that no one would ever believe a broken girl like me over a decorated cop." Steele squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear leaking out and tracking down his gaunt cheek. "But you aren't the law, Reed," Daisy continued, her voice rising in power and conviction. "You're just a bully who hid behind a badge. And you were wrong. They did believe me. Because of Agent Lennox, I have my life back. I have my sobriety. I have my son. And you? You have nothing. You are exactly where you belong. Daisy stepped down from the stand to a murmur of profound respect from the gallery. She walked back up the aisle, taking a seat in the front row, right next to Special Agent Lennox, who gave the young mother a subtle, proud nod. Judge Celeste adjusted her glasses and looked down from the towering mahogany bench. Her silver eyes were devoid of any mercy. "Reed Steele," the judge began, her voice ringing out like a death knell. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a more grotesque abuse of authority. You were entrusted with the sacred duty to protect the vulnerable, and instead, you hunted them. You weaponized the justice system for your own greed. You are a disgrace to the uniform you wore, and a danger to a civilized society." Judge Celeste picked up her heavy wooden gavel. "On the charges of federal racketeering, extortion, civil rights violations under color of law, and narcotics trafficking, it is the judgment of this court that you be remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons for a period of exactly 20 years. The poetic irony of the number hung heavily in the air. 20 years. The exact sentence Steele had so casually threatened to inflict upon Lennox on the side of that dark highway. There will be no possibility of parole, the judge finished, bringing the gavel down with a final, echoing crack. Court is adjourned. Two federal marshals approached Steele. They didn't treat him like a former cop. They treated him like any other convicted felon. They hauled him roughly to his feet, snapping the heavy steel cuffs tightly around his wrists. As they dragged him toward the side door, Steele turned his head, casting one final, desperate look into the gallery. He met Lennox's gaze. Lennox didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply watched him go with the cold, unshakable certainty of a predator who had successfully cleansed her territory of a parasite. 30 minutes later, Lennox and Avery stood on the wide marble steps of the courthouse. The afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the bustling city plaza. "So," Avery said, bumping her shoulder playfully against Lennox's arm, 20 years in a maximum security federal facility. I hear they don't serve very good coffee in there." "He'll adjust," Lennox replied softly. She looked out over the plaza and saw Daisy holding her young son's hand, walking toward the subway, free and unburdened. Lennox reached down, letting her hand rest briefly against the cold metal of the DEA badge clipped to her belt. It was a piece of metal that carried immense, terrifying power, power that could destroy lives or save them. "Are you taking some time off?" Avery asked. "You've earned a vacation." Lennox watched Daisy disappear into the crowd. She thought about the hundreds of other Steeles out there, hiding in plain sight, weaponizing their authority against the voiceless. "No," Lennox said, turning away from the sun and heading toward her unmarked SUV. "The work is never done, Avery. We just have to catch the next one." The badge is a symbol of public trust, not a shield for private cruelty. When those sworn to protect become the monsters in the dark, it takes an unseen force to bring them into the light. Reed Steele thought he had chosen a powerless victim, completely blind to the fact that he had summoned his own ruin. True justice doesn't just cage the corrupt, it liberates the innocent souls they've broken along the way. The shadows never win forever. If this satisfying tale of hidden identities, instant karma, and courtroom justice gave you chills, please hit that like button. Share this story to remind others that no one is above the law. And subscribe for more thrilling dramas.